The truck bed sat so low it nearly scraped the gravel road. 40 cracked cast-iron feed troughs, some split clean down the middle, others missing entire lips, stacked 3 rows high and tied down with baling wire. Neighbors slowed their vehicles to stare. One man, standing outside the feed store, just shook his head slowly and said nothing. That silence was louder than any insult. Her name was Dorothea Crane, and she was 57 years old, 14 months past the funeral of her husband Gerald, and still figuring out how to exist without the second half of a 31-year conversation. The farm was hers now, in that awful total way that things become yours when someone leaves. The bills, the fences, the cracked concrete of the equipment yard, all hers. Nobody had asked her why she wanted 40 cracked feed troughs. They had simply decided she had lost her mind. The troughs had come from the estate auction of a neighboring property, a cattle operation that had been running since the 1940s and finally shuttered when the last son moved to the city. 43 iron troughs, most of them fractured along the weld lines from decades of freezing winters and heavy hooves. 3 were too far gone even for Dorothea. She paid $62 total for the remaining 40. The auctioneer assumed she was confused. He asked her twice if she really wanted them. She did. Here is the part nobody understood yet, and the part that changes everything. Dorothea had been watching how water behaved on her land for most of her adult life, not studying it in any formal sense, just noticing. After a heavy rain, the south pasture drained fast, too fast, and the north end held water in shallow ponds that attracted mosquitoes and rotted the grass roots from below. The east slope was where you wanted moisture to linger, where the soil was deepest, where the old vegetable rows had always produced, but that slope dried out in June and stayed dry through September with brutal consistency. Gerald had talked about irrigation his entire life. He never got around to it. Dorothea had spent the previous winter reading. Not farming manuals exactly. She had stumbled into something more obscure. Articles about passive water harvesting, about berms and swales, about using weight and slope and gravity to redirect rainfall instead of pumping it. And somewhere in a photocopied newsletter from a sustainable agriculture group, she had read a paragraph about how heavy containers placed along a contour line could serve as collection points, slowing runoff, creating micro-reservoirs that fed soil moisture slowly over days. The 40 cracked troughs were not flower pots. They were infrastructure. The cracks were, in fact, the point. A watertight trough would flood and overflow and do nothing useful on a slope. A trough with a crack along the bottom or side would fill during rain, then seep, slowly, consistently, feeding the soil beside it for hours after the storm passed. 40 of them, placed along the contour of the east slope at calculated intervals, would create what Dorothea had privately started calling a passive irrigation chain. She had sketched it out on graph paper at the kitchen table after midnight more times than she could count. None of this was in the sketch she showed anyone, because she showed the sketch to no one. Instead, she backed the truck up to the equipment yard, unhitched the troughs, and started cleaning them with a wire brush. Her neighbor, Patrice, came by that afternoon, stood in the yard with her arms crossed, and said it was the saddest thing she had seen since the funeral. Dorothea thanked her and kept brushing. The problem arrived 3 weeks later in the shape of a man named Hector Villarreal. Hector was 74 years old and had been welding agricultural equipment in the county since before Dorothea was born. He had retired 6 years prior, technically, though he still kept a shop in his barn and took on jobs he found interesting. Dorothea had not planned to involve anyone, but the first technical failure forced her hand. She had positioned the first row of 7 troughs along the upper contour of the east slope, using a line level and stakes to find the grade. The idea was that each trough would be partially buried, about a third of its depth, to stabilize it and make contact with the surrounding soil. She had done 3 of them when she noticed the problem. The fractured iron, exposed to the freeze-thaw cycle of even mild spring nights, was continuing to crack. 2 of the troughs she had already positioned had developed new fractures, longer ones, that would drain them too fast to be useful. She needed the cracks controlled, not sealed. That would defeat the purpose, but slowed. Stabilized so they would seep at a rate she could predict, rather than fracturing further and dumping everything at once. Hector heard about the troughs from someone at the hardware store. He showed up without calling, which is how things worked in that part of the country, parked his truck, walked over to where Dorothea was crouched in the dirt with a measuring tape, and said simply, "What are you trying to do here?" She told him. All of it. The graph paper sketches, the newsletter, the passive seep theory, the contour line placement. He listened without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked to see the cracked troughs she had already pulled back out of the ground. He turned one over in his hands for a long time. He said there was a technique, not common, not taught anywhere formal, involving a low-temperature bronze rod weld applied not to seal a crack, but to stabilize its edges, create a kind of frame around the fracture so it could not propagate further under thermal stress. The crack would remain open but bounded, controlled. He had seen it done once, decades ago, on an irrigation trough at a research farm in the northern part of the state. Dorothea asked if he could do it. He said he was not sure. He would try. The second technical failure came 2 weeks into Hector's work. He had successfully stabilized 11 of the 40 troughs using the bronze edge technique when they realized the seep rate was still inconsistent. Some troughs drained in under an hour. Others held water for nearly 3 days. The difference was not the size of the crack. It was the texture of the iron surface inside the trough, which had oxidized unevenly over decades. Rough, oxidized patches caused water to cling and slow. Smooth patches let it flow. This was not something either of them had anticipated. Hector sat on an overturned bucket and thought about it for a while. Dorothea made coffee on the camp stove she kept in the equipment shed. She brought him a cup without asking if he wanted one. He accepted it without thanking her. They sat in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people working on the same problem. His solution was a clay slurry, a thin mixture of local clay soil and water brushed onto the interior surface of each trough to create a uniform, slow-release layer. The clay would partially seal the micro-pores in the smooth iron sections without blocking the main crack. It would need to be reapplied once a season, but it made the seep rate across all 40 troughs roughly predictable, between 4 and 7 hours of slow drainage per inch of rainfall collected. That was inside Dorothea's target range. The third failure was the one that almost ended everything. She had placed 31 troughs by late summer, working in the early mornings before the heat built, and the system was performing exactly as she had theorized. The east slope was holding moisture visibly longer than it ever had. She had planted a test row of late sorghum down the slope below the trough line, and it was coming up dense and green in a way that the same field had never managed. Then a storm came through that nobody had predicted accurately. Not a catastrophic storm, just a sustained one. 2.5 inches of rain over 14 hours. The troughs filled. They seeped appropriately for the first 6 hours. Then the clay slurry in 9 of the lower troughs, which had been positioned at a slightly steeper section of the contour, began to wash loose from the interior walls. The clay mixed with the water inside the troughs, clogging the cracks partially, and 3 of those troughs overflowed. The overflow cut a small erosion channel down the slope directly through the test sorghum row. She lost about 1/3 of the test planting. She stood at the top of the slope in the rain and looked at the damage for a long time. Hector came the next morning. He looked at the erosion channel and the failed troughs without saying anything dramatic. He walked the length of the channel twice. Then he said, "You need a different clay." The local clay was too soluble. What she needed was a fired clay liner, a thin layer of terracotta paste, heat set inside each trough, that would be water-resistant enough to stay bonded during heavy rain, but porous enough to still slow the smooth iron sections. He knew a man who made decorative pottery in the next county who might have the right material. Dorothea asked how long it would take. Hector said 3 weeks minimum to recoat the problematic troughs and let them cure. 3 weeks in early September on a slope that was finally starting to work. If you've ever had to dismantle something that was almost working, you understand what those 3 weeks cost her. But she did it. Every trough that had failed came back out of the ground. Hector's pottery contact, a quiet man named Santiago who worked alone in a converted chicken house, mixed a fired clay compound to Hector's specification and heat set it inside 22 troughs over 11 days. The troughs went back into the ground. Dorothea did not sleep much during that period. She checked the weather forecast every morning with the focused anxiety of someone who has made a bet they cannot afford to lose. By the middle of September, all 40 troughs were in place, stabilized, lined, and positioned along 3 contour lines on the east slope. The system held through 2 more rain events that month without a single failure. Now here is where the story changes shape. A board member from the Regional Agricultural Cooperative had driven past Dorothea's farm 6 times over the course of that summer on his way to a property he was considering purchasing further down the road. He had noticed the row of old iron troughs on the hillside and thought, initially, that she was using them as planters. Eccentric, he thought, but harmless. The 7th time he drove past in late September, he slowed down enough to see that the slope below those troughs was the greenest thing in a 10-mile radius after what had been a brutally dry summer. His name was Warren, and he was not a man who ignored data presented by a hillside. He stopped at the end of the driveway. He called out. Dorothea came to the porch. He asked if he could look at what she had done on that slope. She said he could. Warren walked the contour line. He crouched down beside 3 different troughs, looked at the cracks, looked at the clay lining, looked at the soil moisture at the base of each one. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Did you design this yourself?" She said mostly. He stood up and looked at the slope, and then at her, and then at the slope again. He said the cooperative had been trying to find low-cost passive moisture retention solutions for smallholder members for several years. They had trialed a number of commercial systems. Nothing had performed consistently at low cost across varied terrain. Dorothea did not say anything. Warren said, "Would you be willing to walk our agronomist through this?" That was in late September. By the end of November, Dorothea had signed a consulting agreement with the regional co-op. Not a massive contract, nothing that would make a headline anywhere, but a recurring arrangement. She would consult on passive water harvesting installations at member farms, adapt her system to different slope profiles and soil types, and train co-op field staff on the placement and maintenance protocols. The initial agreement covered 14 farm visits over the following year, with renewal terms tied to documented soil moisture outcomes. Hector, for his part, got a side arrangement of his own. The co-op needed someone who could teach the bronze edge crack stabilization technique to 2 younger welders on their equipment maintenance team. He agreed to 3 training sessions. He charged them what he considered a fair rate, which everyone else considered extremely low. Nobody argued with him about it. The 40 cracked troughs are still on the east slope of Dorothea's farm. Some of the co-op member installations now use purpose-manufactured troughs with controlled crack profiles. Hector drew up rough specifications for those, working from what the 40 originals had taught him. But the originals are still there, still seeping, still feeding that slope through June and July and the brutal stretch of August. The sorghum test row she replanted after the 3rd failure produced a yield per acre that was high enough to get a mention in the co-op's internal newsletter. It was not a revolutionary number. It was just a good number, on a slope that had never produced a good number before. Patrice came by again the following spring, the spring after the co-op contract, and stood in the same spot in the equipment yard where she had stood before. She looked at the slope. She looked at Dorothea. She said, "I owe you an apology." Dorothea said she did not. Patrice said she really did. Dorothea said, You thought what anyone would have thought. I would have thought the same thing if I had been standing where you were standing and did not know what I knew. That answer is the whole story, really. What looked like a widow driving a ruined truck into a ruined decision was actually a woman with 14 months of grief, 31 years of watching how water moved on a specific piece of land, one winter of reading photocopied newsletters, and a theory she had not yet shown anyone. The ridicule was based on incomplete information. It always is. There is a version of this story where Dorothea explains herself to every person who shakes their head, where she shows the graph paper sketches to the man outside the feed store, where she stops Patrice in the equipment yard and walks her through the passive seep theory. That version does not exist. She kept working. The slope became the argument. Fortune in farming is rarely loud. It looks like a greener hillside in August. It looks like a truck bed sitting low on a gravel road. It looks like something cracked and discarded that someone decided was worth $62 in a theory.